Elon Musk stops at a pawn shop. What he does next leaves everyone speechless. The streets of downtown were alive with their usual symphony of city sounds. Car horns blaring in frustration, faint music spilling from open shop doors, and the hum of distant conversation. Amidst the bustle, the bright neon sign of "Cash for Gold" flickered inconsistently, casting an uneven glow onto the cracked sidewalk below. The pawn shop, a haven for forgotten treasures and desperate souls, sat like a quiet bystander to the chaos outside. Inside, Derek Vaughn slouched behind the counter, absently scrolling through his phone. His shirt was untucked, his tie half loosened, and the grease stains on his sleeves spoke of a man long past caring about appearances. This wasn't his dream job, but it paid the bills, or most of them. The bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer, but Derek didn't bother to look up right away. Most people who wandered in here weren't worth the effort. "Take your time," Derek muttered without lifting his gaze, his voice laced with disinterest. Elon Musk stepped inside, his casual gray t-shirt and jeans blending in so seamlessly with the atmosphere of the shop that no one would have guessed who he was. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, mingled with the sharp tang of metal from the cases filled with dusty jewelry, second-hand electronics, and mismatched oddities. Elon took it all in with an unhurried gaze, his steps measured as he wandered past a rack of tarnished silverware. Derek finally glanced up, giving the customer a quick once-over before dismissing him in his mind as just another browser. The man didn't have the look of someone desperate enough to pawn something or rich enough to buy anything worth noting. Without a word, Derek returned to his phone, his thumb scrolling mindlessly. Elon paused at a glass case near the back, where an assortment of watches rested haphazardly, their price tags dangling from thin strings. One in particular caught his eye, a vintage piece with a cracked face and a strap worn smooth from years of use. He leaned closer, inspecting it with quiet interest. "This one," Elon said, his voice cutting through the silence. "What's its story?" Derek let out a small, irritated sigh before setting his phone down. He didn't like being interrupted, especially not by questions that sounded more curious than transactional. "That old thing?" he asked, dragging himself upright. "Came in a while back. Guy said it was his grandfather's. Needed cash, so I gave him $50 for it." Elon's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And you're selling it for how much?" "$250, Derek replied with a shrug, his tone defensive. "That's a fair price. Vintage watches like that don't come cheap." Elon's gaze lingered on the watch for a moment longer before shifting to meet Derek's eyes. "Do you ever wonder about the people who bring these things in? What they leave behind?" Derek rolled his eyes. "Not really. People come in, they need money, they sell their stuff. That's how it works. You're looking for some kind of sob story, you're in the wrong place." Elon straightened, his expression unreadable. "Interesting business model," he said simply, moving on to the next display. Derek watched him for a moment, uneasy with the man's calm demeanor, before dismissing it as nothing more than idle curiosity. Another customer entered, a wiry man in his late 20s, his clothes rumpled and his eyes darting nervously around the shop. He clutched a small box in his hands as he approached the counter, his movements hurried and tense. "I need cash," the man said, his voice low and strained. "How much for this?" Derek barely spared the man a glance as he reached for the box, flipping it open to reveal a delicate gold bracelet. The intricate design caught the light, suggesting a piece that held both monetary and sentimental value. Derek examined it briefly before snapping the box shut. "$75, he said curtly. "$75? The man repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "This is worth at least $200. "Not here, it's not," Derek replied, his tone cold. "$75's the best you're gonna get. Take it or leave it." The man hesitated, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the box tighter. His eyes flickered toward Elon, who was watching the exchange quietly from a distance. For a moment, it seemed as though the man might argue, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, sliding the box across the counter. Derek counted out the cash with exaggerated slowness, a smirk playing on his lips as he pushed the bills toward the man. pleasure doing business with you, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The man snatched the money and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. Derek chuckled to himself, shaking his head as he turned back to his phone. Some people just don't get how this works, he muttered. Elon walked up to the counter, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. Do you always treat your customers like that? He asked. Derek bristled, his smirk vanishing. What's that supposed to mean? It means you don't seem to care about the people who come in here, Elon said evenly. You see their desperation as an opportunity instead of a responsibility. Derek leaned forward, his tone turning defensive. Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but this is my shop. I run it how I see fit. You don't like it, you're free to leave. Elon held his gaze for a moment before stepping back. Noted, he said, his voice neutral. He turned and walked toward a dusty shelf near the door, his movements deliberate as though he were considering his next move. Derek watched him go, muttering under his breath. Weird guy, he said to himself, shaking his head. But there was something about the man's calm demeanor that stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. For the first time in a long while, Derek felt uneasy in his own shop, as though the balance of power had shifted without him realizing it. Elon lingered by the dusty shelf near the entrance, his fingers idly brushing over the worn surfaces of old trinkets and forgotten keepsakes. The items told silent stories, of things left behind, of choices made in desperation. He picked up a small wooden box, its lacquer peeling, and opened it to reveal a tarnished locket. The delicate engraving on its surface was barely legible, but it spoke of care and craftsmanship from a time long past. Elon turned it over in his hands, his movements careful, almost reverent. Behind the counter, Derek was watching him now, his initial disinterest giving way to something closer to suspicion. There was something about this customer he couldn't quite place. Most people who wandered in either haggled over prices or sulked quietly while pawning off their valuables. But this guy, he didn't fit. He wasn't desperate, but he wasn't dismissive either. He seemed too calm, too calculated, like he was here for more than just a transaction. You gonna buy something? Or just admire the merchandise all day? Derek called out, his tone sharper now, with an edge that dared Elon to respond. Elon glanced over his shoulder, unbothered by the jab. I'm still deciding, he said evenly. His voice devoid of the defensiveness Derek seemed to be fishing for. Derek scoffed, setting his phone down with a thud. Deciding, huh? Well, don't take too long. This ain't a museum. Elon didn't reply, turning his attention back to the locket. He closed the box gently and set it back on the shelf before moving toward another display case. His deliberate movements seemed to irritate Derek even more, as if the man's mere presence was a challenge to his authority in the shop. The bell above the door jingled again, and a middle-aged woman stepped in, clutching a small bag to her chest. Her clothes were neat but worn, and there was a nervous energy about her as she approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "I was hoping to sell this." Derek's expression shifted instantly. He straightened up, his disinterest replaced with a cold, calculating look. "Let's see what you've got," he said, holding out his hand. The woman hesitated for a moment before opening the bag and pulling out a set of silver candlesticks. They were polished to a high shine, their intricate designs catching the light. "They belonged to my grandmother," she explained quietly. "I didn't want to part with them, but I need the money." Derek picked up one of the candlesticks, turning it over in his hands with a practiced air. "Nice pieces," he said, "but they're not worth as much as you think. I can give you $40 for the pair." The woman's face fell. "40?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "But these are solid silver. They're worth much more than that." Derek shrugged, setting the candlestick back on the counter with a dull clink. "Maybe in a high-end auction. But here, that's the best you're gonna get. Take it or leave it." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes, and she clutched the candlesticks to her chest as though trying to shield them from Derek's cold gaze. "I was hoping for at least 100, she said softly. "I really need the money." Derek leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. "Look, "Lady, I'm not running a charity here. $40 is my final offer. You don't like it, you can try your luck somewhere else." The woman's hands shook as she looked down at the candlesticks, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. Elon, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the woman directly. "May I see those for a moment?" She looked up at him, startled but grateful for the interruption. She hesitated briefly before handing the candlesticks over. Elon examined them carefully, his movements deliberate. "These are exquisite," he said, his voice warm. "Your grandmother must have had great taste." The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, the first sign of relief she'd shown since entering the shop. "She did," she said softly. "She always said these were her most prized possessions." Derek rolled his eyes, clearly irritated by the exchange. "What's your deal, man?" he snapped, glaring at Elon. "You some kind of expert now?" Elon ignored him, turning his attention back to the woman. "May I ask why you're selling them?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Derek before settling on Elon. I need the money for my son," she admitted quietly. "He's starting school, and I can't afford all the supplies he needs." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. He set the candlesticks back on the counter and turned to Derek. "You said $40, right?" "That's right," Derek said, his tone smug. "Take it or leave it." Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He counted out $40 in cash and placed it on the counter. "Here," he said, sliding the money toward the woman. "Take this. You don't need to sell these." The woman's eyes widened in shock. I can't accept this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's too much." "It's not too much," Elon replied, his tone firm but kind. "Consider it a gift. Your grandmother would want you to keep these." Derek's face twisted into a sneer. "What are you, some kind of saint?" he spat. "This is a business, not a charity drive." Elon turned to him, his gaze steady. "You keep saying that, as if it justifies taking advantage of people who are already struggling." Derek's jaw tightened, his temper flaring. "Listen, pal, I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my shop. I'm just pointing out what's obvious to everyone else in this room," Elon said calmly. "You're so focused on making a profit that you've forgotten what it means to be human." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Derek leaned forward, his fists clenched on the counter. "You've got a lot of nerve," he growled. "If you don't like how I do things, there's the door." Elon didn't move, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I think I'll stay," he said. "There's more to learn here." Derek glared at him, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "Fine," he snapped. "But don't think for a second that you can come in here and act like you're better than me." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not better than you," he said, "but I am trying to be better for the people who need it." Derek's sneer deepened, but he didn't respond. The woman, clutching her candlesticks and her newfound hope, quietly slipped out the door, her soft "thank you" barely audible over the tension. The shop fell silent again, but the unease lingered like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of more to come. Elon remained where he was, his presence a quiet challenge that Derek couldn't ignore. The tension in the pawn shop clung to the air like static, thick and unyielding. Derek Vaughn, now visibly agitated, kept shooting sharp glances toward Elon Musk, who remained unfazed, idly inspecting a shelf of trinkets as if he had all the time in the world. The earlier exchange with the woman had clearly unsettled Derek, though he tried to hide it under a layer of indignant bravado. He slammed a drawer shut behind the counter, the loud thud echoing in the confined space. "Are you planning to buy something? Or are you just here to play Good Samaritan all day?" Derek snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Elon didn't respond immediately. He picked up a small snow globe from the shelf, tilting it gently to watch the fake snow swirl around the tiny figure of a ballerina inside. "Do you ever wonder how these things end up here?" he asked, his tone conversational but pointed. "Each one tells a story, doesn't it? A moment someone cherished, now forgotten on a dusty shelf." Derek scoffed, leaning heavily against the counter. Save me the poetry, all right? People come in here to get rid of junk. They don't care about stories, and neither do I. It's just business. Elon set the snow globe down with care, turning to face Derek. You keep saying that. Just business. But it seems to me that you're less interested in business and more interested in control. Derek's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. You've got no idea what you're talking about, he growled. This place runs on rules, and if people can't handle them, that's not my problem. The bell above the door jingled again, interrupting their exchange. A teenager walked in, his hoodie pulled low over his face and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He moved quickly, almost nervously, heading straight for the counter. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled a small gaming console out of his bag and placed it on the counter. I need cash, the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek eyed him skeptically, his gaze flicking to the console. Let me guess, your parents don't know you're here? Huh? He said, his tone dripping with condescension. The boy flinched but didn't respond. He kept his eyes fixed on the counter, his fingers fidgeting nervously. Elon watched the interaction closely, his expression unreadable but his presence quietly commanding. Derek picked up the console, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated slowness. This thing's pretty beat up, he said, shaking his head. I'll give you $20 for it. 20? The boy repeated, his voice cracking. But it's worth way more than that. It still works perfectly. Derek smirked, leaning forward. Maybe if you took it somewhere else. But here, that's the best you're gonna get. You don't like it, you can walk out that door. The boy's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. I need more than 20, he said, his desperation evident. Please, can't you just... Kid, I don't do charity, Derek interrupted, his tone sharp. Take the 20 or leave. Elon stepped forward then, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the rising tension in the room. You seem to be quite good at spotting desperation, he said, his voice steady. Is that how you decide your prices? Derek straightened, his eyes narrowing. And what's it to you, huh? You're awfully chatty for someone who hasn't bought a damn thing. It's just an observation, Elon replied. He turned to the boy, his tone softening. How much were you hoping to get for it? The boy hesitated, glancing nervously between Elon and Derek. At least 50, he said quietly. I need the money to help my mom. She's behind on rent, and I thought this might help. Derek let out a derisive laugh. 50? For that junk? Kid, you're dreaming. I'm already being generous offering 20. Generous? Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's one word for it. Derek's temper flared. He slammed the console back onto the counter, the sound making the boy flinch. Look, if you've got a problem with how I run my shop, maybe you should mind your own business. Elon held Derek's gaze, his calm exterior unshaken. It becomes everyone's business when you exploit people who are already struggling. Derek leaned forward, his fists planted on the counter. You think you're better than me, don't you? Coming in here, acting all high and mighty. Let me tell you something, this shop runs because I make the rules. Not you, not some kid, and definitely not some self-righteous stranger who doesn't know when to shut up. The boy stepped back, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension. Elon, however, didn't move. He stood his ground, his presence unyielding but never aggressive. It's not about being better, he said simply. It's about being decent. There's a difference. Derek opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, a middle-aged man entered, his expression tense. He carried a small box under his arm and approached the counter with measured steps. Excuse me, the man said, his voice steady but strained. I was hoping to sell this. Derek shot Elon a glare before turning his attention to the man. Yeah, sure. Let's see what you've got. The man set the box on the counter and opened it to reveal a small collection of vintage coins, each one carefully placed in a protective case. These belong to my father, he explained. I've been holding on to them for years, but I need the money for medical bills. Derek's eyes lit up, though he quickly masked his interest with feigned indifference. He picked up one of the coins, examining it closely. "Not bad," he said, setting it back in the box. "I can give you $50 for the lot." The man frowned, his shoulders tensing. 50? These are worth hundreds, if not more. They're in pristine condition. Derek shrugged, his smirk returning. Maybe to a collector, but here, that's the best you're gonna get. Take it or leave it. The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed the box across the counter. Derek counted out the cash with his usual air of smug superiority, sliding it toward the man without a word of acknowledgement. As the man turned to leave, Elon spoke again, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Do you ever get tired of taking advantage of people?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed. Derek glared at him, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I don't take advantage of anyone," he snapped. "People come to me because they need money. I give them what I can. If they don't like it, that's their problem. Or maybe it's yours," Elon said quietly, his gaze steady. "Because one day, this kind of greed will catch up to you." Derek's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. "You've got a lot of nerve," he growled. "If you don't like how I run my shop, you know where the door is." Elon didn't flinch, his calm demeanor only fueling Derek's anger. "I think I'll stick around," he said. "I'm curious to see how this all plays out." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, Derek looked genuinely unsettled. The shop fell silent again, but the tension was far from over. Derek paced behind the counter, his agitation becoming more apparent with every step. His usual demeanor, cold, smug, and calculating, had shifted into something closer to outright hostility. The quiet composure of Elon Musk was grating on him, chipping away at the control he prided himself on maintaining. He'd dealt with plenty of difficult customers in the past, but something about this man made him feel as if he was being silently scrutinized, his every action weighed and judged. "So, you just planning to loiter here all day? Or are you finally gonna buy something?" Derek snapped, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Elon, standing near a shelf of old electronics, turned slowly to face him. His expression remained calm, almost serene, as if Derek's outburst hadn't registered. "I'm still deciding," he said evenly, his tone carrying no hint of irritation. "There's a lot to take in." Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "Deciding, huh? You've been here almost an hour and haven't spent a dime. If you're not here to do business, maybe you should clear out. I don't run a hangout spot." Elon's eyes flicked toward a dusty clock on the wall, its hands ticking unevenly. "An hour doesn't seem unreasonable for making a thoughtful decision," he replied. "But if you're in a hurry, I could always take my business elsewhere." Derek bristled at the remark, his jaw tightening. "You think I care if you leave? Go ahead. I don't need customers who waste my time." The bell above the door jingled, interrupting the escalating tension. A young woman entered the shop, her expression tense and her movements hurried. She carried a small canvas bag, clutching it tightly as though afraid someone might snatch it away. Her eyes darted around the room before landing on the counter, where Derek stood glaring at Elon. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly, stepping forward. I need to sell something." Derek's attention shifted to her, his expression softening slightly, though only because he saw an opportunity. "What V you got?" he asked, his tone still sharp but less venomous than before. The woman placed the bag on the counter and carefully pulled out a delicate porcelain figurine. It was a ballerina mid-pirouette, her painted features serene and graceful. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail painstakingly rendered. Even Derek, for all his cynicism, seemed momentarily impressed. Derek picked up the figurine, turning it over in his hands as he examined it. "Nice piece," he said, "but porcelain's not worth much. I can give you $30. The woman's face fell, her shoulders slumping. "30? But it's an antique. It's worth so much more than that." Derek shrugged, setting the figurine down with a dull thud. "Not here, it's not. 30's the best you're gonna get." The woman hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the figurine. I was hoping for at least 100, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need it to cover my rent. Derek cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Look, lady, I don't set the market. Take it or leave it. Elon stepped forward, his quiet presence drawing the woman's attention. Do you mind if I take a closer look? He asked gently. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Elon picked up the figurine, examining it with care. It's beautiful, he said, his tone warm. Your mother must have cherished it. The woman smiled faintly, a tear slipping down her cheek. She did. She used to say it reminded her of her ballet days. Elon nodded thoughtfully before turning to Derek. $30 seems a bit low for something this unique. Don't you think? Derek's smirk returned, his confidence reigniting. That's the price, he said firmly. If you think you can do better, go open your own shop. Elon didn't react to the jab. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of cash. I'll give her 100 for it, he said, setting the money on the counter. Derek's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. You can't do that, he snapped. This is my shop, and I decide the prices. I'm not negotiating with you, Elon replied calmly. I'm buying directly from her. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief as she reached for the money. Are you serious? She asked, her voice trembling. Thank you. Thank you so much. Derek slammed his fist on the counter, startling both of them. This isn't how things work, he shouted. You don't get to come in here and undermine my business. Elon turned to him, his expression unflinching. Your business seems to thrive on exploitation, he said evenly. Maybe it's time someone challenged that. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Derek glared at Elon, his face flushed with anger. You've got a lot of nerve, he growled. But you don't scare me. You're just some guy who thinks he's better than everyone else. It's not about being better, Elon replied. It's about doing what's right. Derek sneered, his temper boiling over. You think you're some kind of hero? Walking in here, throwing money around like it makes you better than me? Elon didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the figurine in his hands before setting it down gently. It's not about me, he said quietly. It's about her. And people like her who deserve better. Derek's hands clenched into fists, his frustration reaching a breaking point. You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to run my shop? I've been doing this for years. I know how the world works. People come in here because they need me. They don't get to dictate terms. Elon met his gaze, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Derek's rage. Maybe they don't need you as much as you think, he said. Maybe they just don't have another choice. The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. Derek stared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger, but he couldn't seem to form a response. The woman, clutching her newfound money, slipped out the door quietly, her soft thank you echoing behind her. The shop fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the neon sign outside. Elon turned back to the shelves, his movements unhurried, as though nothing had happened. Derek watched him with a mix of anger and unease, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. The power dynamic had shifted, but the storm was far from over. The air in the shop was thick with tension as Derek Vaughn stared daggers at Elon Musk. His jaw set so tightly it looked like he might crack a tooth. The calm, unbothered presence of Elon had clearly unsettled him, and Derek's confidence was unraveling, thread by thread. Yet instead of backing down, Derek doubled down on his usual defense mechanism: cruelty. He slammed a cabinet drawer behind the counter, drawing the attention of another customer who had just walked in. A frail, elderly man wearing a tattered jacket. The man moved slowly, his cane clicking against the floor with every step as he made his way to the counter. He carried a small, dusty case under his arm, clutching it like it held the last remnants of his dignity. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice raspy but polite. "I was hoping to sell something." Derek rolled his eyes before plastering on a thin veneer of fake politeness. "Sure thing, old-timer. What V you got?" The man carefully set the case on the counter and opened it to reveal a tarnished trumpet. its once bright surface dulled by time and wear. The delicate engravings along the bell hinted at its former glory, and despite its age, it was clear that this was no ordinary instrument. "This belonged to my father," the man explained, his voice tinged with pride and sorrow. He was a jazz musician back in the day, played in all the big clubs in the city. It's seen better days, but it's still in good shape. Derek barely looked at the trumpet before letting out a low whistle of mock admiration. Well, a piece of history," he said, dripping with sarcasm. "I'll give you $40 for it." The old man blinked, his expression faltering. 40, he repeated, his voice trembling. "This is a professional-grade instrument. It's worth far more than that." "Not to me, it's not," Derek said with a smirk. "I might be able to flip it to some collector if I'm lucky. But with all the dents and tarnish, I'd be doing you a favor taking it off your hands for 40. Elon, who had been quietly observing from a few feet away, stepped closer. His gaze moved from the trumpet to the old man, and then to Derek, his expression unreadable. "That trumpet has a story," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not just buying an object. You're buying a piece of someone's life." Derek's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "Oh, here we go again," he said, throwing his hands up in mock exasperation. "You just can't help yourself, can you? Always gotta stick your nose in someone else's business." "It becomes my business when I see someone being taken advantage of," Elon replied evenly. The old man looked between the two, clearly unsure of what to do. "I really need the money," he said softly, his shoulders slumping. "My wife's in the hospital, and the bills are piling up. This trumpet, it's all I have left to sell." Derek snorted, leaning casually against the counter. "Well, that's not my problem, now is it? $40, take it or leave it." Elon turned to the old man, his expression softening. "Do you know how much this trumpet is really worth?" he asked gently. The man nodded hesitantly. "I had it appraised years ago. Back then, they said it could fetch a few hundred at auction. Maybe more if it went to the right buyer." Derek let out a derisive laugh. "A few hundred? Sure, maybe if it were shiny and new. But look at it, it's a wreck. You'd be lucky to get 50. Elon ignored him, addressing the old man directly. "Why not try selling it to someone who appreciates its value? There are music shops and collectors who would love to have something like this." The man shook his head sadly. "I don't have the time or the means to go searching for collectors. And the hospital bills, they can't wait." Derek seized the opportunity to press his advantage. "Exactly," he said, his tone smug. "You need money now, and I'm offering you cash on the spot. No hassle, no waiting. $40 is more than fair." Elon's expression hardened. "Fair? You're exploiting his desperation and calling it fair." Derek slammed his hand on the counter, his patience snapping. "Who do you think you are?" he snarled. "You walk in here, acting all high and mighty, like you know how the world works. Newsflash. This is how business is done. People come in here because they don't have any other options. I'm not running a charity." Clearly, Elon said, his tone sharp. "But there's a difference between running a business and taking advantage of people who are already struggling." Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you've got a little extra cash to throw around. But let me tell you something, you don't scare me. You're just another customer, and this is my shop, my rules." Elon didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said, "but I am trying to remind you that every decision you make has consequences." Derek rolled his eyes and turned back to the old man, dismissing Elon entirely. "So what's it gonna be, old-timer? $40? Or are you walking out of here empty-handed?" The old man hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the trumpet. His gaze lingered on the instrument, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical burden. Elon watched him closely, his mind clearly racing with options. Before the old man could speak, another customer entered the shop, a young woman with a toddler in tow. The little boy clutched a stuffed animal that was missing an ear, his wide eyes taking in the cluttered displays with curiosity. The woman looked harried, her hair disheveled and her clothes wrinkled. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the counter. "I was hoping to pawn this." She held up a small gold bracelet, its delicate chain glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Derek's eyes lit up, though he quickly masked his interest with feigned indifference. "Let's see," he said, snatching the bracelet from her hand. The young woman shifted nervously, glancing at her son, who was now tugging on her sleeve. "I really need the money," she said softly. "My car broke down, and I need to get it fixed so I can get to work." Derek examined the bracelet with exaggerated care, letting out a low hum of mock consideration. "It's decent," he said finally. "I'll give you $30. 30? She repeated, her voice cracking. "But it's real gold. It's worth so much more than that." Derek shrugged, tossing the bracelet onto the counter. "Not here, it's not. 30's the best you're gonna get." Elon stepped forward again, his presence once more shifting the dynamic in the room. "This seems to be a pattern with you," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Offering the bare minimum and calling it generosity." Derek glared at him, his fists clenching at his sides. "What's your problem, huh? You don't like how I run my shop? Then get out. Nobody's forcing you to stay." Elon met his gaze, his expression unyielding. "Maybe I'll stay a little longer," he said quietly. "It seems like there's a lot to learn here." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Derek's frustration was boiling over, but Elon remained steady, his presence an unshakable reminder that change was inevitable. The door slammed shut behind the young woman and her son as they left the pawn shop, clutching their bracelet and $30 with the same defeated posture as so many others before them. Derek Vaughn smirked, clearly pleased with himself, as he stuffed the bracelet into a drawer beneath the counter. He didn't even bother to hide his satisfaction at the lopsided transaction. But the tension in the room was far from dissipated. Elon Musk stood motionless near the shelves, his gaze steady, watching Derek's every move. "You're still here," Derek growled, his voice brimming with irritation. "I don't know if you've got nothing better to do, or if you just enjoy annoying me. But seriously, man, you've overstayed your welcome." Elon remained calm, his voice even. "I'm not finished looking around. You've been looking for over an hour," Derek snapped. "Unless you're planning to buy this entire shop, maybe it's time you moved along." Elon tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Buy the shop? That's an interesting idea." Derek froze for a moment, then let out a sharp laugh. "Right? Like you've got the kind of money it takes to do that." Elon's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, but he didn't say anything more. Instead, he picked up a tarnished pocket watch from a nearby display case, examining it carefully. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as Derek's frustration bubbled closer to the surface. The bell above the door jingled once more, and a group of 3 young men entered the shop. They were loud and boisterous, shoving each other playfully as they made their way to the counter. Their clothes were clean but inexpensive, and they carried themselves with the carefree confidence of youth. One of them held a guitar case, which he set on the counter with a thud. "We're looking to sell this," the boy said, opening the case to reveal an acoustic guitar. It was worn but well-loved, with a few scratches on its surface and strings that had clearly seen better days. Still, it was a beautiful instrument, its craftsmanship evident even through the wear and tear. Derek leaned over the counter, inspecting the guitar with exaggerated disinterest. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "It's mine," the boy replied defensively. "Why does it matter?" "Because I don't deal in stolen goods," Derek shot back, narrowing his eyes. "And this looks like something you might have found." The boy bristled, his jaw tightening. "It's not stolen," he said firmly. "I've had it for years. I'm just trying to get some money to pay for my sister's tuition." Derek snorted, his expression skeptical. "Sure you are. Look, kid, even if it's legit, this thing's barely worth anything. I'll give you $20. 20? The boy repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "This guitar is worth at least 200. "Not to me, it's not," Derek said with a shrug. "Take the 20 or take it somewhere else." The boy's friends stepped forward, their expressions hardening. "Come on, man," one of them said. "You can't just rip us off like that." "Rip you off?" Derek repeated, his voice dripping with mock indignation. "I'm giving you an honest price for what this thing is worth. If you don't like it, the door's right there." Elon, who had been silently observing the exchange, stepped forward. "It's a beautiful instrument," he said, addressing the boy. "How long have you had it?" The boy glanced at him, his anger softening slightly. "Since I was 10, he said. "It was a gift from my dad before he passed." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's clear it means a lot to you. Why not keep it?" "I wish I could," the boy admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But my mom's working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And my sister's college fees are more important than a guitar." Elon turned to Derek, his gaze steady. "Surely you can offer more than $20 for something like this." Derek rolled his eyes, throwing up his hands in exasperation. "Oh, here we go again. Look, Mr. Know-It-All, you don't run this shop, and you don't get to tell me how to price things. $20 is more than fair for a scratched-up old guitar." Elon didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he addressed the boy once more. "What if I buy it from you directly?" Derek slammed his fist on the counter, his face red with anger. "Enough," he roared. "You don't get to come in here and play hero. This is my shop, and you follow my rules or you get out." Elon turned to him, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Your rules seem designed to benefit only yourself," he said. "That's not how business should work." "Don't lecture me," Derek snarled. "You think you're better than me because you've got a little extra cash to throw around? Newsflash. The world doesn't run on fairy tales and handouts. People come here because they need money, and I give them what I can. If you don't like it, you can leave." Elon's eyes flicked to the guitar, then back to Derek. "Maybe it's not about leaving," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about staying and changing things." Derek sneered, his temper flaring even hotter. "Oh, so now you're gonna save the world, huh? Please. You're just another smug customer who doesn't understand how hard it is to keep a business afloat." "Hard?" Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. "It seems to me you've built a system that thrives on taking advantage of people who are already struggling." "That's not hard. That's predatory." The boy and his friends watched the exchange with wide eyes, their earlier anger giving way to awe. It was clear that Elon's words were striking a chord, not just with them but with everyone in the shop. Even Derek, for all his bluster, looked momentarily shaken. But the moment passed quickly, and Derek doubled down. "You don't know a damn thing about me or how I run my shop," he snapped. "So why don't you take your self-righteous attitude and get the hell out?" Elon didn't move. He stood his ground, his presence calm but unyielding. "I think I'll stay," he said. "There's still more to see." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Derek's frustration boiled over, but Elon's steady presence was an undeniable force, one that Derek couldn't seem to shake. The shop, once a place of Derek's unquestioned authority, was shifting slowly but surely. And though Derek couldn't see it yet, the cracks in his foundation were beginning to show. The shop door swung open again, this time with a louder jingle as a woman entered, her presence instantly commanding attention. She was sharply dressed in a tailored blazer and heels that clicked purposefully against the scuffed wooden floor. Her polished appearance contrasted starkly with the cluttered, dimly lit pawn shop. She carried a slim leather briefcase and wore an expression of quiet determination, though a hint of unease lingered in her posture. Derek Vaughn's demeanor shifted as he noticed her. For the first time in hours, he attempted to put on a more professional facade, though the effort was minimal. He straightened slightly behind the counter, brushing some imaginary dust from his shirt, and adopted what he likely thought was a more courteous tone. "Afternoon," he said, his voice unusually even. "What can I do for you?" The woman approached the counter, her heels clicking steadily, and set her briefcase down. "I need to sell some jewelry," she said, her tone clipped but polite. She opened the case to reveal an assortment of neatly organized rings, necklaces, and bracelets, each one sparkling under the shop's fluorescent lights. They were clearly high-quality pieces, the kind that wouldn't typically find their way into a place like Derek's shop. Derek's eyes gleamed with greed, though he quickly masked it with a feigned air of disinterest. "Not bad," he muttered, leaning over the counter to inspect the collection more closely. "Where'd you get these?" "They belong to my grandmother," the woman explained, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of parting with the items. "I've been holding on to them for years, but I need the money for a legal case. It's urgent." Derek picked up a gold necklace, turning it over in his hands as if evaluating its worth. "Legal case, huh? Sounds serious," he said, his tone laced with fake sympathy. "Well, I can give you $100 for the lot." The woman's expression faltered, her composure slipping for just a moment. "100, she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "These are worth thousands. That necklace alone is 18-karat gold." "Yeah, maybe to a jeweler," Derek replied with a shrug, setting the necklace back in the case carelessly. "But here, it's just another shiny trinket. $100 is the best you're gonna get." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration evident. "You're joking, right? These are heirlooms. They have significant value." Derek's smirk returned, his confidence bolstered by her reaction. "Look, lady, I don't set the market. If you don't like my offer, you're welcome to try your luck somewhere else. But good luck finding anyone who'll give you more on the spot." Elon Musk, who had been quietly observing from a few steps away, finally stepped forward. "Those pieces are exquisite," he said, addressing the woman. "Have you considered taking them to an auction house? You'd get far more than what's being offered here." The woman glanced at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and skepticism. "I thought about it," she admitted, "but I don't have time to wait for an auction. I need the money now." Derek rolled his eyes, clearly irritated by Elon's continued interference. "Oh, here we go again," he muttered under his breath. "Look, pal, why don't you mind your own business? You're not a jeweler, and you're definitely not the one buying these." "I'm simply suggesting an alternative," Elon replied calmly. "One that's fair." "Fair?" Derek repeated, his voice rising. "This is my shop, my rules. If she wants to sell here, she plays by them. End of story." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "It seems your rules are designed to benefit you at the expense of others," he said evenly. "That's not how business should be conducted." Derek's face turned red, his temper flaring. "You think you're some kind of saint, don't you? Coming in here, acting like you know everything. Let me tell you something. You don't know a damn thing about running a business." Elon remained composed, his voice steady. "I know enough to recognize exploitation when I see it." The woman watched the exchange with wide eyes, clearly torn between gratitude for Elon's support and discomfort at the escalating tension. She reached for the briefcase, closing it with a snap. "Maybe I should go," she said softly, her voice uncertain. Derek's frustration boiled over. "Yeah, maybe you should," he snapped. "If you don't like my offer, don't waste my time." Elon stepped closer, his presence steady and unyielding. "You don't just sell things here," he said, his tone measured but firm. "You sell desperation. You take advantage of people when they're at their lowest, and you call it business." Derek sneered, his fists clenching at his sides. "And what do you call it, huh? Charity? You think the world runs on handouts? Newsflash, it doesn't. People come to me because they need money, and I give them what I can. That's how it works." "Maybe it's time for things to work differently," Elon said quietly. Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. "You don't get to tell me how to run my shop," he growled. "You're just another customer, and you're lucky I haven't thrown you out yet." The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Derek's anger radiated like heat, but Elon's calm demeanor was an undeniable force, unshaken by the hostility. The bell above the door jingled again, and a man in a maintenance uniform entered, his expression wary. He carried a toolbox and glanced around the shop before addressing Derek. "You called about the power outage in the back room?" Derek scowled, his irritation turning toward the newcomer. "Yeah, took you long enough," he snapped. "It's been out all day. Get back there and fix it." The maintenance worker nodded, clearly used to dealing with difficult clients, and disappeared into the back room. The interruption gave Derek a moment to collect himself, though his frustration was still evident in the tight set of his jaw. Elon, however, wasn't finished. He turned back to the woman, his voice gentle. "If you'd like, I can help you find a better place to sell your jewelry," he offered. "There are reputable buyers who would give you what it's truly worth." The woman hesitated, her grip on the briefcase tightening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I might take you up on that." Derek let out a harsh laugh. "Oh sure, run off and sell it somewhere else. See how far you get. But don't come crying back to me when you realize I was your best option." Elon's gaze didn't waver as he met Derek's eyes. "It's not about options," he said. "It's about dignity." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger, but he couldn't seem to form a response. The woman nodded her thanks to Elon before turning and leaving the shop, her heels clicking against the floor. The room fell silent once more, the only sound the faint hum of the neon sign outside. Derek's authority, once absolute within the confines of his shop, was beginning to crumble piece by piece. And though he refused to see it, the cracks were spreading, threatening to bring down the entire foundation of his carefully constructed world. The door swung shut behind the woman, the jingle of the bell fading into silence. Derek's glare burned into Elon as he leaned heavily on the counter, his knuckles whitening against the edge. His irritation had simmered to a boil, spilling over in the form of curt, stinging remarks directed at every person who crossed his path. Elon's unyielding presence, calm and resolute, only added fuel to Derek's simmering temper. "You've got some nerve hanging around like you own the place," Derek sneered, his tone sharper than ever. "You think you're some kind of white knight? Newsflash, this is the real world. People like you don't last here." Elon didn't flinch. He picked up a chipped vase from a shelf, examining it as though Derek's rant had barely registered. "It's interesting how you treat people like commodities," he said, setting the vase down carefully. "Everyone who walks in here has a story, a struggle, but you seem to see only their desperation." Derek rolled his eyes, scoffing. "Oh, spare me the moral high ground. You don't know a thing about these people. They come to me because they need cash, not a shoulder to cry on. And guess what? I give them what they need." "No," Elon corrected, his voice steady. "You give them what benefits you the most." Before Derek could snap back, the doorbell chimed again. This time, a young man entered, his face gaunt and his clothes ill-fitting. He carried a small, battered box under his arm, holding it as if it contained something of great importance. His eyes darted nervously around the shop before landing on the counter. Hi," the young man said hesitantly, his voice shaky. I need to sell something." Derek didn't bother to hide his irritation. He barely glanced at the man before barking, "What have you got? Make it quick." The young man placed the box on the counter, opening it to reveal a tarnished wristwatch. Its once polished face was scratched, and the strap was worn thin, but it was clear the watch had sentimental value. It was my dad's," the man stammered. "He passed away last year. I've been holding on to it, but I really need the money." Yeah, Derek interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Spare me the sob story. Let me see it." He snatched the watch from the box, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated indifference. "Not bad," he said finally, setting it down with a thud. "I'll give you $10. "10?" the young man repeated, his voice cracking. "But it's an antique. It's worth way more than that." "Not to me, it's not," Derek replied smugly. $10, take it or leave it." The young man's hands trembled as he reached for the watch, his expression a mix of defeat and desperation. "I was hoping for at least 50, he said quietly. "I need it to pay for my medication." Derek snorted, shaking his head. 50? For this piece of junk? You're dreaming, kid. 10's the best you're gonna get." Elon, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. "It's a beautiful watch," he said, addressing the young man. "Have you tried taking it to a jeweler? They might be able to give you a better price." The young man shook his head, his shoulders slumping. I don't have time for that, he admitted. I need the money now. Derek's patience snapped. Then take the $10 and stop wasting my time, he barked. I don't have all day. Elon turned to Derek, his calm demeanor unshaken. It seems you're more interested in exploiting people's urgency than helping them, Derek sneered, leaning forward until his face was inches from Elon's. And what are you gonna do about it, huh? You think you're some kind of hero? Get real. This is how the world works. You either play the game or you lose, or you change the rules, Elon said evenly. Derek laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Change the rules? You're delusional. This is my shop and I make the rules here. If you don't like it, there's the door. Elon didn't move. He turned back to the young man, his voice gentle. What if I buy it from you directly? He offered. I'll give you the 50 you need. The young man's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you serious? He asked, his voice trembling. Thank you. Thank you so much. Derek slammed his hand on the counter, his face red with anger. That's it, he roared. I've had enough of you meddling in my business. You don't get to come in here and play savior. This is my shop and I decide how things work. Then maybe it's time for a change, Elon said quietly. Derek's fists clenched, his frustration boiling over. He turned to the young man, his voice venomous. Get out, both of you. I don't need customers like you. The young man grabbed the watch and hurried out the door, his whispered thanks barely audible over the sound of Derek's ranting. Elon remained where he was, his presence unyielding. The shop fell silent again, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger. Why are you still here? He spat. What do you want from me? Elon met his gaze, his expression calm but resolute. I'm not here for you, he said simply. I'm here for them. Derek's sneer faltered, his confidence wavering for the first time. But he quickly masked it with another burst of anger, his voice rising as he tried to reassert control. You think you can just waltz in here and change the way I do business? You've got another thing coming. We'll see, Elon replied, his tone steady. The doorbell jingled once more, signaling the arrival of another customer. But this time, Derek didn't even glance their way. His focus was entirely on Elon, the man who had disrupted his carefully constructed world and refused to back down. The cracks in Derek's authority were growing wider, and though he couldn't see it yet, the foundation of his empire was beginning to crumble. The doorbell jingled again, but this time, it was followed by heavy, uneven footsteps that echoed across the wooden floor. A man in his late 50s entered the shop, his worn coat hanging loosely on his thin frame. He carried a small duffel bag that had clearly seen better days, its fabric fraying at the seams. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. He paused near the door, scanning the room nervously before approaching the counter. Derek Vaughn, already on edge from his confrontation with Elon Musk, barely concealed his disdain as he glanced up from behind the counter. Great, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. Another charity case. The man hesitated, clutching the duffel bag tightly, before clearing his throat. I was hoping to sell a few things, he said quietly, his voice tinged with desperation. Derek leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms with a look of exaggerated impatience. Of course you were, he drawled. Let's see what you've got, then. Make it quick. The man unzipped the bag, carefully pulling out a collection of small items. A tarnished silver locket, a pair of antique cufflinks, and a pocket knife with an intricately carved handle. He placed them on the counter with trembling hands, his gaze darting between Derek and the items. These belong to my father, he explained softly. He passed them down to me, but I need the money to cover my rent. I'm behind, and my landlord's threatening to evict me. Derek picked up the locket, inspecting it with feigned disinterest. Silver, huh, he said, holding it up to the light. Maybe $50, tops. The man's face fell. 50, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's solid silver, and the cufflinks are vintage. They're worth much more than that. Derek shrugged, setting the locket down with a thud. Not to me, they're not. Look, pal, I don't know what sob story you've cooked up, but this isn't a museum. If you want cash, this is the best you're gonna get. The man's hands trembled as he reached for the locket, his shoulders slumping further under the weight of Derek's words. Elon, who had been quietly observing the exchange from a few steps away, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. That locket has sentimental value, Elon said, addressing the man directly. Are you sure you want to part with it? The man hesitated, his eyes welling up with tears. I don't have a choice, he admitted. If I don't pay my rent by the end of the week, I'll be out on the street. Elon turned to Derek, his gaze steady. Surely you can offer him a fair price, he said, his tone calm but firm. Derek let out a bitter laugh, throwing up his hands in mock exasperation. Oh, here we go again. Look, buddy, I don't know what your deal is, but you need to stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. This is my shop, and I run it how I see fit. Your way of running things seems to prioritize profit over people. Elon replied evenly. That's not how a community should work. Derek slammed his hand on the counter, his face flushing with anger. A community? He spat. This isn't some kumbaya campfire circle. This is business. People come in here because they're desperate, and I give them what I can. If they don't like it, they can leave. Elon didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken. Desperation doesn't justify exploitation, he said quietly. You have the power to help people, but instead, you choose to take advantage of them. Derek's sneer deepened, his fists clenching at his sides. You think you're better than me, don't you? He growled. Walking in here with your holier-than-thou attitude, like you've got it all figured out. Newsflash. You don't know a damn thing about me or my shop. I know enough to see that you're creating more problems than you're solving, Elon replied. And that's not sustainable. Before Derek could retort, the doorbell jingled once more, and a young woman entered, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She carried a small bundle wrapped in a blanket, cradling it close to her chest. Her hands trembled as she approached the counter, her gaze darting nervously around the room. Excuse me, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I need to sell something. Derek rolled his eyes, letting out an audible groan. What now? He muttered, his irritation boiling over. Fine, let's see it. But make it quick. I don't have all day. The woman unwrapped the bundle to reveal a delicate porcelain figurine, its surface painted with intricate details. It depicted a mother and child, their expressions tender and full of love. Despite its beauty, the figurine was clearly old, with small cracks running along its base. This belonged to my grandmother, the woman explained, her voice shaking. She gave it to me when I had my son. But I need the money for his medication. He's sick and the treatment is expensive. Derek snatched the figurine from her hands, turning it over with a critical eye. Porcelain, huh? He said, his tone dismissive. Looks like junk to me. I'll give you $20. The woman's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. 20? She repeated, her voice cracking. But it's all I have left. I was hoping for at least 100. Derek shrugged, setting the figurine down with a thud. Not my problem. 20's the best you're gonna get. Elon stepped forward again, his presence commanding the room. That figurine represents a bond between generations, he said, addressing the woman directly. Are you sure you want to part with it? I don't want to, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I don't have a choice. My son's health comes first. Elon turned to Derek, his gaze unwavering. You can do better than 20. Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. Why don't you stay out of it? He snapped. You don't get to walk in here and tell me how to run my shop. Elon met his gaze, his expression calm but resolute. Someone has to, he said quietly, because clearly you've forgotten what it means to be human. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Derek's authority, once absolute within the confines of his shop, was beginning to crack under the weight of Elon's unyielding presence. The customers watched the exchange with a mix of awe and hope, their faith in humanity rekindled by Elon's steadfast determination to stand up for what was right. But for Derek, the cracks were spreading, threatening to bring down the entire foundation of his empire. And though he refused to see it, the collapse was only a matter of time. His authority, once absolute, now felt tenuous and fragile, eroded by Elon Musk's unrelenting presence and quiet defiance. Each customer who entered seemed to chip away at Derek's control. Their stories of desperation met with Elon's unwavering compassion and Derek's unrepentant greed. Derek's annoyance had metastasized into full-blown anger, and it showed in the sharpness of his tone and the harshness of his gestures. The bell jingled yet again, and an older woman entered, her small frame bundled in a heavy coat that seemed too large for her. She clutched a worn purse close to her chest, her face lined with worry. Her gaze flitted nervously around the room before settling on Derek. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I was hoping to sell something." Derek looked up from the counter, his scowl deepening as he spotted the woman. "What is this charity hour?" he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. He straightened and crossed his arms. "What VE you got?" The woman hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. She opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring, its surface adorned with a single modest diamond. Despite its simplicity, the ring radiated sentimentality, its well-worn band telling a story of years of devotion. "This was my wedding ring," she said quietly. "I've kept it for so long, but I need the money for my heating bill. Winter's been so cold this year." Derek snorted, barely glancing at the ring. "Gold? Huh? I'll give you $20. The woman's face fell, her lips trembling as she clutched the box tighter. "But it's real gold. And the diamond is tiny," Derek interrupted, his tone dismissive. "Barely worth anything. Take the 20 or don't. Makes no difference to me." Elon, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. "That ring isn't just a piece of gold," he said, addressing the woman gently. "It's a symbol of a life shared, of memories made. Are you sure you want to part with it?" The woman hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't want to," she admitted, "but I don't have a choice. If I don't pay my heating bill, I don't know how I'll get through the winter." Elon turned to Derek, his voice steady. "Surely you can offer her more than $20. Derek sneered, his patience wearing thin. "Oh, here we go again," he snapped. "Why don't you mind your own business? If you're so concerned, why don't you buy it off her yourself?" "Maybe I will," Elon replied evenly. "But that doesn't excuse your behavior." Derek slammed his fist on the counter, his face flushed with anger. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my shop," he roared. "I don't need some self-righteous know-it-all breathing down my neck." Elon met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not telling you how to run your shop," he said quietly. "I'm reminding you what it means to have integrity." Derek's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "Integrity doesn't pay the bills," he growled. "This is business, and if you don't like it, you know where the door is." Elon didn't move, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Exploitation isn't business," he said. "It's a failure of character." Before Derek could respond, the doorbell jingled again, and a young couple entered the shop, their arms entwined. They looked nervous but determined, their eyes scanning the room before settling on the counter. The man carried a guitar case, and the woman held a small jewelry box. "We were hoping to sell these," the man said, placing the guitar case on the counter. The woman opened the jewelry box to reveal a delicate pearl necklace, its luster undiminished by age. "These were my grandmother's pearls," the woman explained, "and this guitar was a gift from my dad. But we're trying to save up for a down payment on a house." And Derek cut her off with a derisive laugh. "Oh great, another sob story," he said, shaking his head. He opened the guitar case and inspected the instrument with exaggerated care. "Well, it's in decent shape. I'll give you $40 for the guitar and $50 for the pearls." "40?" the man repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "This guitar is worth at least $200, And the pearls are real, the woman added, her voice trembling. They're worth so much more than that. Derek shrugged, his smirk returning. Not to me, they're not. Take it or leave it. Elon stepped forward once more, his voice calm but firm. You seem to have a habit of undervaluing things, he said. Or maybe you're just overvaluing your own power. Derek sneered, his temper flaring. And you seem to have a habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, he snapped. You think you're some kind of savior? Newsflash, you're not. You're just another customer, and you don't get to tell me how to do my job. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job, Elon replied evenly. I'm here to remind you that your actions have consequences. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. The young couple exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Derek's authority, once absolute, now felt tenuous and fragile, eroded by Elon's unrelenting presence and quiet defiance. The woman closed the jewelry box with a snap, her hands trembling. Maybe we should go, she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. Yeah, maybe you should, Derek said smugly, because you're not going to find a better offer anywhere else. Elon turned to the couple, his expression kind. There are better options out there, he said gently. Don't let this man convince you otherwise. The couple nodded, murmuring their thanks, and left the shop, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? He spat. Coming in here, messing with my business. You don't know a damn thing about me or what it takes to run a place like this. I know enough to see that you're taking advantage of people who are already struggling, Elon replied. And I know that's not sustainable. Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. You think you're better than me? You think you can just walk in here and change the way I do things? You've got another thing coming. Elon didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken. We'll see, he said quietly. The shop fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the neon sign outside. Derek's authority, once unquestioned, now hung by a thread. And though he refused to see it, the foundation of his empire was beginning to crumble. The shop's oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. Derek Vaughn's simmering frustration had evolved into open hostility, and his once calculated cruelty had become more brazen, each exchange steeped in venom. Elon Musk remained a quiet but commanding presence, his calm demeanor both unsettling and infuriating to Derek. Each customer who entered added to the tension, their struggles met with Derek's ruthless indifference and Elon's quiet but firm interventions. The bell above the door jingled once more, and a middle-aged man entered, his clothes rumpled and his face lined with exhaustion. He carried a small wooden box, the kind that looked as though it might hold keepsakes or treasures from another era. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though each one took effort. His eyes darted around the shop nervously before he approached the counter. Afternoon, he said, his voice rough, almost hesitant. I was hoping to sell this. Derek didn't bother to hide his disdain. He gave the man a quick once-over, his lip curling in a sneer. Another one, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. Let's see what you've got. The man placed the box on the counter and opened it to reveal a collection of old postcards, each one carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The edges were slightly frayed, but the vibrant illustrations on the fronts hinted at their age and uniqueness. The man reached into the box and pulled out one of the postcards, holding it up for Derek to see. These belong to my grandfather, he explained. He collected them during his travels around the world. Some of them are over 100 years old. Derek barely glanced at the postcards before letting out a derisive laugh. Postcards, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. You're kidding me, right? Who the hell wants old postcards? They're antiques, the man said, his voice firm but tinged with desperation. Some of them are rare, valuable even, Derek snorted, shaking his head. Valuable to who? Look, buddy, I don't deal in junk. You're better off taking these to a flea market. The man's expression faltered, his shoulders sagging. Please, he said softly, I need the money. My car broke down and I can't get to work without it. These postcards. They're all I have left. Derek rolled his eyes, reaching into the box and pulling out a random postcard. He examined it for all of 2 seconds before tossing it back into the box carelessly. "I'll give you $10 for the lot," he said, his voice flat. "10?" the man repeated, his voice cracking. "But they're worth so much more than that. Some of these are from the early 1900s. They're collector's items." "Not to me, they're not," Derek replied with a shrug. "Take the 10 or take them somewhere else. I don't care." The man's hands trembled as he reached for the box, his despair palpable. Elon, who had been quietly observing from a few feet away, stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the man. "These postcards are a piece of history," Elon said, his gaze steady. "Have you tried reaching out to collectors or auction houses? They might be able to give you what they're truly worth." The man shook his head, his expression one of resignation. "I don't have the time," he admitted. "I need the money now. If I don't fix my car, I'll lose my job." Derek let out an exasperated sigh, slamming his hand on the counter. "Oh, for crying out loud," he snapped. "Do you people rehearse these sob stories before you come in here? Look, pal, I'm running a business, not a charity. $10 is my final offer." Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. "You have an opportunity to do the right thing," he said quietly. "Why not take it?" Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. "And what's it to you?" he snapped. "You think you're some kind of hero? Newsflash, you're not. You're just a nosy customer who doesn't know when to back off. I'm just pointing out that your actions have consequences," Elon replied evenly. "You may not see it now, but the way you treat people matters." Derek's fists clenched at his sides, his temper flaring. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he growled. "Walking in here acting all high and mighty, like you've got it all figured out. Well, let me tell you something. You don't know a damn thing about me or how I run my shop. I know enough to see that you're exploiting people's desperation," Elon said. "And I know that's not sustainable." Before Derek could respond, the doorbell jingled again, and a young woman entered the shop. She carried a large canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her expression tense but determined. She approached the counter, her movements purposeful, and set the bag down with a thud. "I need to sell this," she said, her voice steady. Derek raised an eyebrow, his irritation momentarily replaced by curiosity. "What is it?" he asked, leaning over the counter. The woman reached into the bag and pulled out a stack of vinyl records, each one carefully sleeved. She placed them on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. "These were my dad's," she said. "He was a DJ back in the 70s. These records, they're his legacy. But I need the money to pay for my mom's medical bills." Derek picked up one of the records, flipping it over and examining the label. "Vinyl, huh?" he said, his tone dismissive. "These are a dime a dozen. I'll give you $20 for the lot." "20?" the woman repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "These are rare pressings. Some of them are worth hundreds." "Not to me, they're not," Derek replied smugly. "Take the 20 or leave it. Makes no difference to me." Elon stepped forward once more, his voice calm but firm. "These records represent a lifetime of passion and creativity," he said, addressing the woman directly. "Are you sure you want to part with them?" "I don't want to," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I don't have a choice. My mom's treatments are expensive, and the bills just keep piling up." Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. "You can do better than $20, he said. Derek let out a bitter laugh, throwing up his hands in mock exasperation. "Here we go again," he said. "Why don't you just buy the records off her if you're so concerned?" "Maybe I will," Elon replied evenly. "But that doesn't excuse your behavior." Derek slammed his fist on the counter, his face flushed with anger. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my shop," he roared. "I've had enough of your meddling. If you don't like how I do business, you can get the hell out." "I'm not leaving," Elon said quietly, "because someone needs to hold you accountable." The shop fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Derek's authority, once absolute, was now hanging by a thread, and the cracks in his foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. Yet for all his bluster, Derek refused to back down, his pride blinding him to the storm that was rapidly approaching. The pawn shop's atmosphere had become an oppressive cauldron of tension, thick with unspoken challenges and Derek Vaughn's simmering anger. His once smug confidence was eroding, replaced by an almost frantic need to assert his authority. Elon Musk's calm but unyielding presence was like a stone in Derek's shoe, persistent, irritating, and impossible to ignore. Every time Derek thought he had regained control, Elon's quiet defiance reminded him of just how fragile his power truly was. The doorbell jingled yet again, and a teenage boy entered, his skinny frame lost in an oversized hoodie. He held a skateboard under one arm, its deck covered in stickers and scuffed from years of use. His eyes darted nervously around the room as he approached the counter. "I need to sell this," the boy said quietly, placing the skateboard on the counter. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nervousness. Derek raised an eyebrow, his irritation evident. "A skateboard," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What am I supposed to do with that?" "It's a collector's item," the boy explained, his voice gaining a bit of confidence. "It's from a limited edition release. It's worth a lot." Derek picked up the skateboard, flipping it over and inspecting the underside. "Limited edition, huh?" he said, feigning interest. "Looks like a piece of junk to me. I'll give you $15. "15? The boy repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "But it's worth at least $100. I've seen them sell online for even more." Derek let out a derisive laugh, shaking his head. "Online, maybe, but this isn't the internet, kid. This is a pawn shop. You want cash, you take what I offer." The boy's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frustration evident. "That's not fair," he said. "You're just trying to rip me off." Derek's smirk widened, his tone turning even more condescending. "Fair? Welcome to the real world, kid. Life isn't fair. You want money, you take my offer. Or you can walk out that door and try your luck somewhere else." Elon, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. "It's a well-crafted board," he said, addressing the boy directly. "Why are you selling it?" The boy hesitated, glancing at Derek before turning back to Elon. "My mom lost her job," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're behind on rent, and I wanted to help." Elon's expression softened, his voice calm but firm. "That's admirable," he said, "but you shouldn't have to give up something you care about to help your family." Derek let out a loud scoff, slamming the skateboard back onto the counter. "Oh, give me a break," he snapped. "You think this kid's the only one with problems? Everyone who walks in here has a sob story. I'm running a business, not a therapy session." "You're running a racket," Elon replied evenly. "You take advantage of people when they're at their most vulnerable and you call it business." Derek's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know a damn thing about me or how I run my shop," he growled. "So why don't you keep your opinions to yourself and let me do my job?" "Your job," Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call this?" Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. "Listen, pal," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I've had enough of your crap. You're not a customer, you're a problem. And if you don't like how I do things, you can get the hell out." "I'm not going anywhere," Elon said calmly, "because someone needs to stand up to people like you." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. The boy watched the exchange with wide eyes, clearly unsure of how to react. Derek's authority, once unquestioned, now felt tenuous and fragile, eroded by Elon's steady defiance and the quiet strength of his words. The doorbell jingled again, and a woman entered, carrying a small, bedraggled suitcase. She looked exhausted, her hair disheveled and her clothes wrinkled. She approached the counter with a weary determination, setting the suitcase down in front of Derek. "I need to sell this," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. Derek sighed loudly, throwing up his hands in mock exasperation. "What is this? A parade of sob stories, he muttered under his breath. He opened the suitcase to reveal a collection of neatly folded clothes and a few small trinkets. A silver bracelet, a pair of earrings, and a framed photograph of a young girl. "These belong to my daughter," the woman explained, her voice trembling. "She passed away last year. I've been holding on to them, but I need the money for a bus ticket. I need to get to my sister's place before I lose everything." Derek picked up the bracelet, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated care. "Silver, huh?" he said, his tone dismissive. "I'll give you $20 for the lot." "20?" the woman repeated, her voice cracking. "But these are all I have left of her." "Not my problem," Derek said with a shrug. "Take it or leave it." Elon stepped forward once more, his voice calm but firm. "These items are irreplaceable," he said, addressing the woman gently. "Are you sure you want to part with them?" The woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I don't want to," she admitted. "But I don't have a choice." Elon turned to Derek, his gaze unyielding. "You have the power to help her," he said. "Why not do the right thing?" Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. "The right thing?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think that matters? This is business, not a charity." "Business doesn't have to be heartless," Elon replied. "It can be a force for good." Derek leaned forward, his face twisted with anger. "You don't know a damn thing about business," he growled. "You think you're better than me because you've got a little extra cash to throw around? Newsflash. The world doesn't run on kindness." "Maybe not," Elon said quietly, "but it could." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger, but he couldn't seem to form a response. The woman gathered her belongings and left the shop, her whispered, "Thank you," directed at Elon. Derek Vaughn's patience, already frayed, was now hanging by a thread, and his barely restrained hostility spilled over into every interaction. His sharp words and dismissive tone were a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to cling to the power he felt slipping away. Elon Musk's quiet but unyielding presence continued to unsettle him, every calm remark from Elon like another crack in Derek's carefully constructed facade. The doorbell jingled again, and a man in his mid-30s entered, carrying a small box wrapped in an old towel. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room as though he were afraid of being recognized. His clothes were clean but threadbare, and his posture suggested a man who had been beaten down by life but was still trying to stand tall. Derek barely looked up as the man approached the counter. "What do you want?" he snapped, his tone more impatient than usual. I need to sell this," the man said quietly, setting the box on the counter. He unwrapped the towel to reveal a chess set, its pieces carved from what appeared to be ivory and ebony. Despite its age, the set was in pristine condition, the craftsmanship evident in the intricate details of each piece. Derek's eyes flicked to the chess set, and for a moment, his irritation was replaced by genuine interest. But the moment passed quickly, and his usual sneer returned. "A chess set," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Wow, real impressive. It's an antique," the man explained, his voice steady despite Derek's hostility. "It was my grandfather's. He brought it with him when he emigrated to this country." Derek picked up one of the pieces, a knight, and turned it over in his hands, pretending to inspect it. "Looks like junk to me," he said, tossing the piece back onto the board. "I'll give you $20 for it." "20?" the man repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "But it's worth so much more than that. I had it appraised years ago, and they said it could be worth a few thousand to the right buyer." "Yeah, well, I'm not the right buyer," Derek said with a shrug. "Take the 20 or take it somewhere else. Makes no difference to me." The man's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath, clearly struggling to keep his composure. "I need the money," he said finally. "My wife's in the hospital and we're drowning in medical bills. I don't have time to shop it around." Derek rolled his eyes, leaning back against the counter. "Not my problem," he said flatly. "You want cash, you take what I offer. Otherwise, you're wasting my time." Elon stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "That chess set is a family heirloom," he said, addressing the man directly. "Are you sure you want to part with it?" "I don't want to," the man admitted, his voice trembling. "But I don't have a choice. My family needs the money." Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. "Surely you can offer him more than $20, he said. Derek let out a bitter laugh, throwing up his hands in mock exasperation. "Oh, here we go again," he said. "Why don't you just buy it off him yourself if you're so concerned?" "Maybe I will," Elon replied evenly. "But that doesn't excuse your behavior." Derek slammed his hand on the counter, his face flushed with anger. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my shop," he roared. "I've had enough of your meddling. If you don't like how I do business, you can get the hell out." "I'm not leaving," Elon said quietly, "because someone needs to hold you accountable." The man watched the exchange with wide eyes, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Derek's authority, once absolute, now felt tenuous and fragile, eroded by Elon's steady defiance and the quiet strength of his words. The man hesitated, then gathered up the chess set and left the shop, murmuring his thanks to Elon as he passed. The door swung shut behind him, leaving an oppressive silence in his wake. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he snarled. "Walking in here acting all high and mighty, like you've got it all figured out. Well, let me tell you something. You don't know a damn thing about me or how I run my shop. I know enough to see that you're exploiting people's desperation," Elon said. "And I know that's not sustainable." Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. "You think you can just waltz in here and change the way I do things? You've got another thing coming." Elon didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken. "We'll see," he said quietly. The doorbell jingled again, and a young woman entered, carrying a small wooden crate filled with mason jars. She approached the counter with hesitant steps, her hands trembling slightly as she set the crate down. "I was hoping to sell these," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Derek sighed loudly, shaking his head. "Mason jars," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What am I supposed to do with mason jars?" "They're filled with homemade preserves," the woman explained. "My grandmother taught me how to make them. I've been selling them at farmers markets, but I haven't been able to make ends meet." Derek picked up one of the jars, examining it with exaggerated care. "Preserves, huh?" he said. "Yeah, I'll give you $10 for the whole crate." "10?" the woman repeated, her voice cracking. "But they're worth so much more than that. I spent weeks making these." "Not my problem," Derek said with a shrug. "Take it or leave it." Elon stepped forward once more, his voice calm but firm. "Those jars represent hours of hard work and dedication," he said, addressing the woman directly. "Are you sure you want to sell them?" "I don't want to," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I don't have a choice. I need the money to keep the lights on." Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. "You have the power to help her," he said. "Why not do the right thing?" Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. "The right thing?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think that matters? This is business, not a charity." "Business doesn't have to be heartless," Elon replied. "It can be a force for good." Derek leaned forward, his face twisted with anger. "You don't know a damn thing about business," he growled. "You think you're better than me because you've got a little extra cash to throw around? Newsflash. The world doesn't run on kindness." "Maybe not," Elon said quietly, "but it could." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger, but he couldn't seem to form a response. The woman gathered her crate and left the shop, her whispered, "Thank you," directed at Elon. Elon Musk stood quietly near the shelves, his calm presence an unspoken challenge that Derek couldn't seem to shake. The bell above the door jingled again, and a burly man entered, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. He carried a large cardboard box, his face set in a determined scowl. He looked around the shop, his gaze lingering briefly on Elon before approaching the counter. "I've got something to sell," the man announced, his voice deep and gravelly. Derek raised an eyebrow, sizing him up with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "What V you got?" he asked, leaning lazily against the counter. The man placed the box on the counter and opened it to reveal a collection of vintage motorcycle parts. The metal gleamed under the shop's fluorescent lights, the pieces clearly well-maintained despite their age. "These are from a 1953 Harley Panhead," the man explained. "Rare parts. Took me years to collect them, but I need the cash." Derek picked up one of the parts, inspecting it with feigned interest. "Not bad," he muttered, turning it over in his hands. "But these don't mean much to me. I'll give you $50 for the lot." "50?" the man repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? These are worth hundreds, maybe more. Maybe to someone who knows what to do with them," Derek replied with a shrug. "But to me, they're just a pile of old metal. Take the 50 or take them somewhere else." The man's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "That's robbery," he growled. "You're trying to rip me off." Derek sneered, crossing his arms. "Call it what you want," he said. "But this is how business works. You want cash, you take my offer. If not, the door's right there." Elon stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Those parts are more than just metal," he said, addressing the man directly. "They're a piece of history. Why not sell them to a collector who'll appreciate their value?" The man hesitated, glancing at Elon with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I don't have time for that," he admitted. "I need the money now." "Then let me help you find someone," Elon offered. "You shouldn't have to settle for less than they're worth." Derek let out an exasperated sigh, slamming his hand on the counter. "Oh, for crying out loud," he snapped. "Why don't you just buy them off him yourself if you're so concerned? Better yet, why don't you buy my whole damn shop?" Elon turned to Derek, his gaze steady. "Maybe I will," he said quietly. Derek froze for a moment, his sneer faltering as the words sank in. But he quickly recovered, letting out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, right," he said. "Like you've got that kind of money." Elon didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the man and handed him a card. "Call this number," he said. "They'll connect you with a buyer who'll give you a fair price." The man nodded, murmuring his thanks, and left the shop, his steps heavy but purposeful. Derek's glare burned into Elon as the door swung shut behind the man. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" Derek growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Walking in here, acting like you're better than me. Newsflash, you're not. You're just another customer who doesn't know how the real world works. I know enough to see that you're creating more problems than you're solving." Elon replied evenly. "And I know that's not sustainable." Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. "You think you can just waltz in here and change the way I do things? You've got another thing coming." Before Elon could respond, the doorbell jingled again, and a young woman entered, her arms full of books. She struggled to carry them to the counter, her face red from the effort. She set them down with a thud, her breathing heavy. "I was hoping to sell these," she said, her voice shaky. Derek glanced at the books, his sneer returning. "Books?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What am I supposed to do with books?" "They're first editions," the woman explained, her voice gaining strength. "Some of them are rare." Derek picked up one of the books, flipping through the pages carelessly. "Yeah, well, they're not rare to me," he said, tossing it back onto the pile. "I'll give you $20 for the lot." "20?" the woman repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "But they're worth so much more than that." "Not to me, they're not," Derek replied smugly. "Take it or leave it." Elon stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Books are windows into other worlds," he said, addressing the woman directly. "Are you sure you want to sell them?" "I don't want to," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I don't have a choice. My student loans are crushing me, and I need the money to pay rent." Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. "You can do better than $20, he said. Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. "Here we go again," he said. "Why don't you just buy the books off her if you're so concerned? Maybe I will, Elon replied evenly. But that doesn't excuse your behavior. Derek slammed his fist on the counter, his face flushed with anger. You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my shop, he roared. I've had enough of your meddling. If you don't like how I do business, you can get the hell out. I'm not leaving, Elon said quietly, because someone needs to hold you accountable. The bell above the door jingled again, and a man in a rumpled suit entered, carrying a briefcase that looked as though it had seen better days. He hesitated near the door, his gaze flitting between Derek and Elon before he took a deep breath and approached the counter. I'm here to sell this, the man said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. He placed the briefcase on the counter and opened it to reveal a set of pristine fountain pens, each one carefully placed in its own velvet-lined slot. The pens gleamed under the shop's harsh fluorescent lights, their craftsmanship evident even to the untrained eye. Derek raised an eyebrow, his sneer returning. Fountain pens, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You've got to be kidding me. They're vintage, the man explained, his voice gaining strength. My grandfather collected them. Some of these are limited editions, they're worth a lot. Derek picked up one of the pens, turning it over in his hands with feigned interest. Yeah, they're nice, he said finally, tossing the pen back into the case carelessly. But they're not worth much to me. I'll give you $30 for the set. 30? The man repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. But they're worth hundreds, maybe more. Maybe to someone who cares about fountain pens, Derek replied with a shrug. But to me, they're just fancy sticks. Take the 30 or take them somewhere else. The man's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. That's not fair, he said, his voice trembling with frustration. You're just trying to take advantage of me. Derek let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Fair? This isn't about fairness, pal. This is business. You want cash, you take what I offer. If not, there's the door. Elon stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. Those pens are more than just writing instruments, he said, addressing the man directly. They're a piece of history, a testament to craftsmanship. Are you sure you want to part with them? I don't want to, the man admitted, his voice shaking. But I don't have a choice. My wife lost her job, and we're struggling to make ends meet. Elon's gaze softened, his voice steady. I understand, he said, but there are better options out there. You shouldn't have to settle for less than they're worth. Derek slammed his hand on the counter, his face flushing with anger. Oh, for crying out loud, he snapped. Why don't you just buy the damn pens yourself if you're so concerned? Maybe I will, Elon replied evenly. But that doesn't excuse your behavior. Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Elon's. Listen, pal, he growled. I've had enough of your crap. You think you can just waltz in here and change the way I do things? You've got another thing coming. I'm not trying to change you, Elon said calmly. I'm trying to remind you that your actions have consequences. The man hesitated, then gathered up the pens and left the shop, murmuring his thanks to Elon as he passed. Derek's glare burned into Elon as the door swung shut behind the man, his frustration reaching a boiling point. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? Derek snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Walking in here acting all high and mighty, like you've got it all figured out. Well, let me tell you something. You don't know a damn thing about me or how I run my shop. I know enough to see that you're exploiting people's desperation, Elon replied evenly. And I know that's not sustainable. Before Derek could respond, the doorbell jingled again, and a woman entered, carrying a small jewelry box. She approached the counter with hesitant steps, her hands trembling slightly as she set the box down. I was hoping to sell this, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Derek glanced at the box, his sneer returning. Jewelry, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. What am I supposed to do with jewelry? It's an antique, the woman explained. It belonged to my great-grandmother. The necklace inside is solid gold, and the earrings have real diamonds. Derek picked up the necklace, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated care. Yeah, it's nice, he said finally, but it's not worth much to me. I'll give you $50 for the lot. 50. The woman repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. But it's worth so much more than that. I've seen similar pieces sell for thousands. Not to me, they're not, Derek replied smugly. Take the 50 or leave it. Elon stepped forward once more, his voice calm but firm. That jewelry represents generations of your family's history, he said, addressing the woman directly. Are you sure you want to sell it? I don't want to, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I don't have a choice. My husband left me, and I need the money to support my kids. Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. You have the power to help her, he said. Why not do the right thing? Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. The right thing, he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. You really think that matters? This is business, not a charity. Business doesn't have to be heartless, Elon replied. It can be a force for good. Derek leaned forward, his face twisted with anger. You don't know a damn thing about business, he growled. You think you're better than me because you've got a little extra cash to throw around? Newsflash. The world doesn't run on kindness. Maybe not, Elon said quietly, but it could. The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. Derek glared at Elon, his chest heaving with anger, but he couldn't seem to form a response. The woman gathered her box and left the shop, her whispered, "Thank you," directed at Elon. The doorbell jingled, and a man in his 40s entered. His rugged demeanor, complete with a grease-stained shirt and calloused hands, suggested a blue-collar worker who'd seen better days. He carried a toolbox, its once bright red paint chipped and faded. His steps were hesitant as he approached the counter, his eyes darting nervously between Derek and Elon. I need to sell this, the man said, setting the toolbox down with a dull thud. He opened it to reveal a collection of well-worn tools, each one clearly cherished despite its age and wear. Derek glanced at the tools and immediately sneered. Tools, he said, his tone laced with disdain. What am I supposed to do with those? They're good tools, the man said, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. Snap-on, Craftsman, all quality brands. They've lasted me years. Yeah, well, they've seen better days, Derek replied, picking up a wrench and inspecting it with exaggerated disinterest. I'll give you $20 for the lot. 20. The man repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. But they're worth so much more than that. Just this wrench alone is worth more than 20. Not to me, it's not, Derek said with a shrug. Take it or leave it. The man's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. You're trying to rip me off, he said, his voice trembling with frustration. These tools, they're all I have left. Not my problem, Derek said flatly. You want cash, you take what I offer. Otherwise, you're wasting my time. Elon stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. Those tools are more than just objects, he said, addressing the man directly. They're a testament to your hard work, your skill. Are you sure you want to sell them? I don't want to, the man admitted, his voice shaking. But I don't have a choice. My wife left me, and I need the money to keep a roof over my kids' heads. Elon turned to Derek, his expression unyielding. Surely you can offer him more than $20, he said. Derek sneered, his frustration boiling over. Oh, here we go again, he said. Why don't you just buy the damn tools yourself if you're so concerned? Maybe I will, Elon replied evenly. But that doesn't excuse your behavior. Derek slammed his fist on the counter, his face flushed with anger. You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my shop, he roared. I've had enough of your meddling. If you don't like how I do business, you can get the hell out. I'm not leaving, Elon said quietly, because someone needs to hold you accountable. Derek's sneer deepened, his fists clenching at his sides. Accountable? He repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think you're some kind of hero? Newsflash, you're not. You're just a nosy busybody who doesn't know when to back off. I'm someone who believes that business can be a force for good, Elon replied calmly. And I'm here to prove it. Derek's laughter was bitter, almost hysterical. Prove it, he said, shaking his head. "You're delusional. You don't know the first thing about how the world works." "I know more than you think," Elon said, his voice steady but firm. The room fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Derek's glare burned into Elon, his chest heaving with anger. He opened his mouth to deliver another biting remark, but before he could speak, the doorbell jingled once more. A young man in a suit entered, his confident demeanor and polished appearance a stark contrast to the shop's usual clientele. He walked straight to Elon, his steps purposeful and assured. "Mr. Musk," the man said, his voice crisp and professional. "The arrangements have been finalized. The transfer is complete." Derek froze, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Elon and the man. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of confusion and anger. Elon turned to face Derek, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I believe you mentioned earlier that I should buy your shop," he said quietly. "So I did." Derek's face turned an alarming shade of red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You what?" he sputtered. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," Elon replied. "As of 15 minutes ago, this shop is under my ownership." The words hit Derek like a sledgehammer, the reality of the situation sinking in with devastating clarity. He stumbled back a step, his hands gripping the counter for support. "You can't do this," he said weakly, his voice trembling. "You can't just walk in here and take everything." "I didn't take anything," Elon said evenly. "I paid for it fairly, I might add." "Something you seem to have trouble understanding." The young man in the suit stepped forward, holding out a folder filled with documents. "Here's the deed transfer and the proof of purchase," he said, his tone businesslike. "Everything is in order." Derek snatched the folder from the man's hands, his eyes scanning the documents frantically. But there was no denying the truth. The shop, his livelihood, his empire now belonged to Elon Musk. "You think this is funny?" Derek snarled, throwing the folder onto the counter. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life?" "I think it's time for a change," Elon said calmly. "This shop has the potential to be so much more than what you've made it." "What gives you the right?" Derek spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything I've built? You think you're better than me?" "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Elon replied evenly. "But I do believe in accountability. And your actions have consequences, Derek." Derek slammed his hand on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. "Consequences?" he barked. "Who the hell do you think you are, lecturing me about consequences? You don't know what it's like to work for everything you have. You were probably born with a silver spoon in your mouth." Elon's expression didn't falter. If anything, his calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Derek further. "You're wrong," Elon said simply. "I wasn't handed anything. I worked hard for everything I have. But this isn't about me, Derek. It's about the way you've treated people." "Oh, give me a break," Derek snapped, throwing up his hands. "You come in here with your self-righteous attitude, acting like some kind of savior. Do you even hear yourself?" Elon stepped closer, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "I hear myself, Derek, and so does everyone else in this room. The difference is that I'm not afraid to stand up for what's right." Derek sneered, his face twisted with contempt. "You're full of it," he said. "You don't care about these people. You're just here to stroke your own ego." Elon's calm demeanor didn't waver. "If that's what you need to believe to justify your actions, so be it. But the truth is, you've spent years exploiting people who came to you in their time of need. You've taken advantage of their desperation and profited from their pain. That stops today." Derek's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "And you think you're going to stop me? You think buying this shop changes anything? I'll find a way to rebuild. You'll see." "You're welcome to try," Elon said calmly. "But perhaps it's time you reconsider how you treat people. Because the way you've been doing things clearly isn't working." Derek's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with suppressed rage. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, one of the customers stepped forward, a middle-aged woman who had been quietly observing the exchange. "He's right," she said, her voice steady but firm. You've been treating people like dirt for years, Derek. We all know it. You've taken advantage of every person who's walked through that door, and it's about time someone held you accountable. Derek turned on her, his face flushed with anger. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped. I've been running this shop for years, keeping it afloat through thick and thin. You have no idea what it takes. I know what it takes to be a decent human being, the woman shot back. And clearly you don't. Another customer chimed in, their voice filled with indignation. She's right. You've been ripping people off for as long as I can remember. We all came here because we didn't have anywhere else to go, and you used that against us. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room as more customers began to speak up, their voices rising in a chorus of frustration and resentment. Each one recounted their own experience of being shortchanged, dismissed, or outright humiliated by Derek. The weight of their collective anger was palpable, and for the first time, Derek looked truly shaken. This isn't fair, Derek shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. You're all ganging up on me like I'm some kind of monster. I was just doing my job. Exploitation isn't a job, Elon said quietly. It's a choice, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice. Derek's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who might come to his defense. But the faces that stared back at him were filled with anger, disappointment, and, in some cases, pity. The realization that he was utterly alone hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he seemed to deflate. I didn't mean for things to get this bad, he muttered, his voice barely audible. But they did, Elon said. And now you have an opportunity to make things right. Derek's sneer returned, though it lacked its usual bite. Oh, and I suppose you're going to tell me how to do that. I'm not here to tell you what to do, Elon replied. That's a decision you have to make for yourself. But if you continue down this path, you'll only hurt yourself and everyone around you. The customers, emboldened by Elon Musk's presence and Derek's public humiliation, lingered in the shop, some watching silently while others whispered among themselves. Derek's glare scanned the room, his eyes burning with resentment as he realized he had lost the respect of everyone present. You think you've all got me figured out, don't you? Derek spat, his voice dripping with venom. You come in here with your sob stories and your holier-than-thou attitudes, expecting me to give you something for nothing. Newsflash. The world doesn't work that way. A man in the back of the shop, a younger customer who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. You're right about one thing, he said, his voice steady. The world doesn't always work the way it should. But that doesn't mean you have to make it worse for people who are already struggling. Derek's laugh was bitter and hollow. Oh, spare me the lecture, he snapped. You think you're better than me because you've got some shiny moral compass? Newsflash. Morals don't pay the bills. No, but they help you sleep at night, the young man shot back. And I don't know how you've been able to do that with the way you treat people. The room murmured in agreement, the customer's collective resentment bubbling to the surface. Derek's grip on the counter tightened, his knuckles white as he leaned forward, his face twisted with anger. None of you know what it's like to run a business, Derek snarled. The sacrifices it takes, the pressure. You all think it's so easy to sit there and judge me, but you don't have a clue. Elon, who had remained silent during the latest exchange, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Running a business is about more than making money, Derek, he said. It's about creating value, building trust, and treating people with respect. If you can't do that, then you've already failed. Derek turned his glare on Elon, his eyes blazing with fury. And what would you know about failure, he barked. You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter. You don't know what it's like to struggle, to fight for every scrap. You're wrong, Elon said simply, his tone unshaken. I've faced challenges, setbacks, and failures just like anyone else. But I've always believed that success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about how you achieve it. Derek's sneer deepened, his fists clenching at his sides. Save your speeches for someone who cares, he growled. You think you've won just because you bought this shop? You think that makes you better than me? This isn't about winning or losing, Derek, Elon replied. It's about making things right. Derek's laugh was sharp and bitter. Right? You think you're making things right by embarrassing me in front of everyone? By taking away the one thing I have left? You took that away from yourself, Elon said quietly. Your actions, your choices, they led you here. I'm just holding up a mirror. The room fell silent again, the weight of Elon's words settling over everyone present. But instead of reflecting on his behavior, Derek's anger only grew, feeding off his humiliation like a fire-consuming dry wood. You think you're some kind of hero? Derek spat, his voice rising. Walking in here, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, I've got news for you. You're just a man. And men bleed. The threat hung in the air, its weight unmistakable. The customers froze, their eyes darting between Derek and Elon, unsure of what would happen next. Derek's chest heaved with rage, his breathing ragged as he stared Elon down, daring him to respond. But Elon didn't flinch. He didn't even move. His calm demeanor remained unbroken, a stark contrast to Derek's unraveling composure. You're right, Elon said finally, his voice steady. I am just a man. But that doesn't excuse your behavior. Derek slammed his fist on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. Get out of my shop, he roared, his voice cracking under the strain. All of you, get out. The customers hesitated, their feet shuffling uncertainly as they exchanged nervous glances. One by one, they began to move toward the door, murmuring among themselves as they left. But Elon remained where he was, his presence an immovable force that seemed to challenge Derek's every word and action. I said, get out, Derek shouted, his face red with fury. I'm not going anywhere, Elon replied calmly. This isn't your shop anymore, Derek, and it's time you accepted that. The reality of Elon's words seemed to hit Derek like a punch to the gut. His body sagged slightly, the fight draining out of him for a brief moment. But it didn't last. Derek straightened, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to stand tall, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. You think this is over? Derek growled, his voice low and dangerous. You think you've won just because you've humiliated me in front of these people? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Elon said. A man who's so consumed by his own ego that he's lost sight of what really matters. Derek's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with barely contained rage. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, his anger boiling over into something physical. But instead, he turned away, his shoulders hunched as he stormed toward the back room, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the shelves. The room fell silent once more, the tension lingering like the aftermath of a storm. Elon remained where he was, his expression calm but resolute as he surveyed the empty shop. The echoes of Derek's fury still reverberated in the air, a stark reminder of the man's unchecked arrogance and refusal to change. I don't think I can fix everything, Elon replied, but I can try, and so can you. Derek didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the counter. The quiet that followed was filled with unspoken challenges, but Elon didn't press further. Instead, he turned to the remaining customers, addressing them directly. This shop is going to be different, he said. From now on, it's a place where everyone is treated with respect, where fairness matters more than profit. And I hope you'll hold us accountable to that promise. The customers murmured their agreement, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and cautious optimism. For the first time in years, the pawn shop felt like a place of possibility rather than despair. As the crowd began to thin, Derek remained behind the counter, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer any words of thanks or apology, nor did he make any attempt to change his demeanor. But the weight of his defeat was evident in every line of his posture. Elon approached the counter one last time, his voice quiet but firm. You have a choice, Derek, he said. You can keep holding on to your anger, or you can let it go and start building something better. The decision is yours. Derek didn't respond, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes suggested that Elon's words had left an impression. Whether that impression would lead to change remained to be seen. But for now, the pawn shop had taken its first step toward a brighter future. Elon turned and walked toward the door, his presence a reminder that even in the face of anger and despair, there was always the possibility of something better. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, the sound carrying with it the promise of a new beginning.